Thank you for joining us, everyone, tonight. My name is Chip Gibbons, and I am the Policy Director of Defending Rights and Dissent. Just one brief announcement from the beginning. Glenn Greenwald, who was scheduled to be with us tonight, was unable to make it. He had difficulty with his internet connection, which came up with us at the very last minute. I strongly apologize. We are working on trying to get Glenn to do another event with us on this topic. We're working with his schedule to do that. So hopefully we will be bringing him to you at some point. But we just had such a good panel tonight already, and we had so many of you who had expressed interest in this. We want to go forward with it. So recently, Donald Trump, when asked about a pardon for whistleblower Edward Snowden, claimed he was looking into it. While it's unclear how serious his answer was or what his intentions were, this has sparked a renewed discussion about Snowden. Now, Snowden exposed the extent of the National Security Agency's mass surveillance programs. As a result, he became another in a long line of whistleblowers indicted under the Espionage Act. Time and time again, we've seen when people have exposed serious government misconduct, including surveillance like Snowden, or torture or war crimes like Chelsea Manning and John Kiriakou. It's not the people who carry out these abuses of power who get in trouble, it's the whistleblower, oftentimes indicted under the draconian Espionage Act, which was first passed during World War I. Unfortunately, with Trump involved, much of the discourse has resolved around him and his role. And even when it doesn't, many of the loudest voices we've heard have been proponents of mass surveillance and secrecy. So we at Defending Rights and Dissent feel that you, the people, deserve a chance to hear a different perspective, the perspective of national security whistleblowers and those who defend them against a system that is stacked against them. So tonight's panel does just that. I'm very honored tonight to be joined by two highly distinguished guests. We have Thomas Drake. Thomas is an NSA whistleblower. He was a 10-year veteran of the Air Force specializing in intelligence. He served as a CIA analyst and contractor for the National Security Agency for 12 years before joining the agency full-time in 2001. While he was at the NSA, he was disturbed by fraud and abuse he witnessed and brought his concerns to his superiors, the Inspector General and Congress. When this did not work, he gave unclassified information to the Baltimore Sun. The government retaliated against Drake by charging him under the Espionage Act, something we're going to hear from him about tonight. Our other guest is William Neuheisel. William works at the Whistleblower and Source Protection Program at ExposeFacts. Whisper was founded to represent national security whistleblowers. It was founded to protect the most controversial and courageous truth tellers in the world. Its founder, Jesselyn Radack, had represented Drake along with Snowden, and we're very honored to have both William and Tom tonight. Tom, I want to start with you tonight, since you yourself were an NSA whistleblower, and for people who aren't familiar with your story, what was it that you saw that disturbed you? How did you try to blow the whistle on it? And what was the response to you doing so by those in power?
Well, it's important to note you don't wake up one morning and as you're going into work saying, hey, I'm going to become a whistleblower today. This is not something that, it's not a career aspiration. It was not one of the jobs that I saw listed as a career when I was in high school with their career counselor. But it was 9/11 was my first day on the job. Little did I know what I would confront. And it was three things. It was massive waste and abuse in the billions, 9/11 intelligence failures that we could have prevented 9/11. But the one thing that became central to my case and the government really going after me was I discovered to my horror that NSA was an abject violation of the Constitution, the Fourth Amendment, right after 9/11, all in the greatest of secrecy. In fact, it was a program much more secret than even the torture program, as it turns out. And so I began to blow the whistle with my superiors, including my immediate supervisors, the number 3 at NSA, the IG. I was actually part of 2 formal 9/11 congressional investigations, but all of my material witness evidence, including the mass surveillance regime, the epigenesis of the mass surveillance regime, was all suppressed. The only record that exists that anybody can find is I was interviewed. And I continued to blow the whistle with them all through the summer of 2002. And then I was actually part of another investigation with the Department of Defense. I ultimately touched the third rail. I ultimately went to the press with what I knew that was unclassified regarding all three of those areas, including the mass surveillance regime. And let's just say the government was very upset about that. And I ultimately became the target after severe retaliation and losing my job, but severe retaliation. I ultimately became the target, in which I was actually told that I was the ringleader of a conspiracy against the United States of America with others. And I faced, at one point, I was threatened with the rest of my life in prison. Ultimately, they charged me under the Espionage Act. I was the first whistleblower since Ellsberg charged in like manner. And for 14 months, I did everything I could with the assistance of Jesselyn, Radack, and public defenders, as well as other lawyers, to keep the government at bay, and went free in a plea agreement in which they dropped all 10 felony counts. And I just pled out to a minor misdemeanor for doing what? For exceeding authorized use, not unauthorized, but exceeding authorized use of a computer. Needless to say, it turned my life inside out and upside down. But what happened is, by exposing a crime committed by the state, then what I had actually, what I had violated was a state crime.
Thank you very much, Tom, for that story. William, you work for Whisper, which represents national security whistleblowers, many of which, like Snowden and like Drake was, are charged under the Espionage Act. When a whistleblower is charged under the Espionage Act, what do they face?
They face an uphill battle. It's extremely difficult to mount a defense against an Espionage Act charge, largely because there essentially is no defense against an Espionage Act charge. The law has, over the years, essentially morphed into a strict liability case. Now, what do I mean by that? It means that, unlike other criminal statutes, there are no exculpatory defenses. So, for example, you can't say that there was a defense of necessity, or there's a public interest defense. It's a simple question of, did you hand over the documents? Did you make the disclosures, or did you not? And so in Edward Snowden's case, he has already admitted to making the disclosures, but a court would actually not only not consider a public interest defense, but actually bar his defense team from making that case. We've seen a number of Espionage Act cases that the defense team has been face a gag order, essentially, that they were barred from using phrases in front of a jury such as the word whistleblower or the words good motive. And so, really, someone like Edward Snowden would not face an open or just trial as we know it. This would not be justice.
Sure. Thank you for that, William. So I'm sure you've both heard questions like this before, and you're probably sick of hearing it, but because it gets thrown around a lot, I feel the need to bring it up. Something that opponents of pardoning Edward Snowden always bring up time and time again is that if he saw something that so concerned him that there were official or proper channels he could have gone through. Were there such channels, and would they have been impactful for Snowden to go through?
Well, there are channels, but I am, I'm example number one in disclosure channels, as they call them, becoming exposure channels. And I knew that when I blew the whistle. Look, the government's not going to take too kindly, let alone an entire agency at the top level, in the top deck, up to and including the director of NSA, for you to even go to Congress, let alone the press. And I had already gone, to Congress many years earlier with what NSA was actually doing that was approved by the President of the United States. I mean, this was a tippy top state secret. So you're blowing the whistle on an agency that's actually committing a crime, a violation of the Constitution. And even though I was a senior executive, the temerity to actually hold the government accountable because, hey, it's all legal. The president approved it. So what's the problem? And so there is no question. And, that's at the highest levels of the government in the terms of my own whistleblowing, up to and including, implicating the president and the vice president, George Tenet, and Michael V. Hayden, then director of NSA, as well as others. But they did all this in secret. So because it was in secret and it's involving a incredibly sensitive compartment, even within the secrecy system, even above the normal access to the NSA, very few people knew about this because they knew what they were doing. But this was this is 9/11. We just need the data. We just need to know it all. We just need to find out where the threat is. Who cares about the rights of anybody? Hey, and if you've done nothing, no harm, no foul. So all channels I went through were literally exposure channels, and I knew that at each stage. Even when I was going to Congress with material evidence regarding the mass surveillance regime, as well as the other things I mentioned, 9/11 intelligence failures, just massive fraud, waste, and abuse. Later, I was told that what I had shared with the committee was so secret that it couldn't even be in the secret report. So by virtue of being charged with espionage, which historically was to go after real spies, not whistleblowers, it's now become the go-to statute in which someone like myself and others, including Edward Snowden, end up being charged with.
So Tom, you mentioned earlier that no one wakes up in the morning and says, I'm going to be a whistleblower. And I've interviewed other national security whistleblowers before, and that's something that I hear time and time again, that like no one starts off their career thinking they're going to be a whistleblower. And you mentioned that you knew you were up against really a very strong power structure. Why did you feel compelled to tell the truth and alert people about what was going on, knowing all of this?
Some people call me naive, and that because I took an oath 4 times to support and defend the Constitution, a piece of paper, someone later told me it was quaint and out of it was no longer relevant in today's age, particularly post 9/11. I was actually told that, by the way. You just don't understand.
Or by...
Yeah. Oh, at NSA. Oh, yeah. Oh, no, at NSA. Yeah, people, it's like, you got to look the other way, Tom, because, the threat to the state is so large, is so huge, that we're going to have to, as Dick Cheney said 5 days after 9/11, we're going to have to go to the dark side. Yeah. Or as Cofer Black said, we're going to take the gloves off. I don't think people fully appreciated what Vice President Cheney or Cofer Black really meant. I was seeing it from the inside. And so it was crossing the Rubicon. This was the state, the national security state, with the blanket cover of the President of the United States deciding that violating the Constitution and all of our rights, it didn't matter, right? That the threat took priority, that national security actually trumped, and I'm saying trumped the Constitution. So it didn't matter that my oath actually was secondary to the non-disclosure agreements. And even though the non-disclosure agreements, which I had signed many of them, do not permit using the secrecy system to cover up crimes and wrongdoing, they still did it because it was approved by the president.
So what made you go for it then?
Look, I exercised moral agency. I knew what I was confronting. This was Pandora's box. I was looking deep into the abyss, and what was happening is the abyss was staring back at me, and I jumped into the abyss. That's exactly what I did. I wasn't going to wait. I just jumped in, and I knew that by doing so, it was fraught with enormous peril. I knew that I could easily lose my job. It was just a matter of when, not if. And I knew that if I went to the press, although I believe I would have been charged anyways, even if I hadn't. You see, they actually thought I went to the New York Times. I had nothing to do with the New York Times. I never went to the New York Times. But the government's paranoia to protect what was truly one of the deepest ever national state secrets. It was that secret. It was that close hold. They thought that I was the ring bearer, as it were, in terms of the disclosures, and had direct access to Eric Lichtblau and James Risen. The irony of it is I never had any contact with those reporters. Did I have a contact with one reporter? Yes, at the time, who worked at the Baltimore Sun. But that was in the public interest. And, William mentioned there is no public interest defense. There isn't. You can make your case at sentencing to mitigate, but there's no public interest by virtue of being charged with espionage. I mean, look, the government said the worst possible things about me, that I had caused the most serious damage, the gravest damage to the national security of the United States, that I would have the blood of American troops on my hand, that I was worse than a spy. If there was something even stronger in the Espionage Act, they would have used it, but there wasn't. And the reason I was worse than a spy is that what I revealed ultimately was, quote unquote, disclosed in the reporting in the Baltimore Sun meant that everybody got to read the secrets, including the spies. So who was I spying for? Yeah, there's a question.
Yeah, that's always something that people point out, that people, I know with Chelsea Manning's trial, I mean, she was accused at one point of aiding the enemy, and people pointed out that, who is the enemy if you're giving information to the American public? Is the American government view the public as the enemy? So I guess
that, Chip, is a really good point. I mean, there's been a number of disclosures throughout history that the government has screamed that this is revealing our deepest secrets to our enemies, to the Soviets or to Al Qaeda. But in most cases, the disclosures, it turns out, were not secret to the rest of the world. They were primarily secret from the American people.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true with the WikiLeaks revelations from Chelsea Manning. I think that the Iraqis and the Afghans had, no illusions about what was going on.
No, Chip.
Yes.
Chip, I've had extremely long conversations with Ellsberg. I got to know Ellsberg really, really well. I actually consider Ellsberg not just a colleague, a fellow whistleblower in terms of history. He came from my mom's generation, so I have a foot in both generations, right? The sort of the pre-millennial, but actually post World War II and the boomers. I'm more of a late boomer, not an early boomer, born in the late 50s. And in my conversations with Ellsberg, he revealed the bright and shining lie of Vietnam, but he went through every channel that existed then, and it was radio silence. Everybody wanted to continue to keep the illusion that, if Vietnam fell, South Vietnam, that was a domino effect and communism was going to overrun the world. That's not true at all. It was not true. And so he was part of the study that actually revealed how far we had gone in terms of hiding the truth about Vietnam. And so he made a fateful decision himself. And he always wondered, why didn't more people come forward? Because most people don't want to lose their job, their career, family, mortgages, all the things that, quote unquote, are everyday security. Most people will not put those at risk. I knew what was at risk was history. Eventually, these kind of secrets come out, but I just happened to be there as an eyewitness. And even though I was part of a number of decision-making trees, including, I was actually at one point tasked to speak truth to Congress, I got yanked from that because they didn't want the truth told even with Congress. Even NSA wanted to hide under the cover of the president how far they had gone. Not just had slid off the rails, we were in an entirely different vehicle. And part of my oath to the Constitution was to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign, domestic. We were in an entirely different vehicle, and it was the national security vehicle. And it was now in the driver's seat. So I got run over. I mean, it was, in the end, I got run over. Not just railroaded, I was run over. And if I can, I understood that.
And if I can, just to make clear for everyone, try to put in perspective the importance of Tom Drake's case and how it relates to Snowden, and to go back in the history of the Espionage Act. There's been a battle since 1917 about the Espionage Act. The Wilson administration wrote it and wanted an official secrets act. Congress thought they were getting a law actually targeted towards spies and saboteurs, and in the end, it was something of a muddle. It was a very poorly drafted, very vague law, a lot of problems in it, overly broad, very vague standards, and it evolved over time. It was into a method to silence dissent. It was more they're more war protesters that have been arrested than actual spies or whistleblowers, and so part of it got rescinded after World War I, but that law was still really on the books for decades, and sort of sort of lay dormant in a sense for a while until the 70s under Ellsberg, when they tried to charge him with the Espionage Act, and that case, of course, fell apart. And so then in the 80s, you had the Morrison case, who was an analyst who sold some photographs to Jane's Defense magazine because he claims that he wanted to warn the American people about defense weaknesses in our military forces. And the government at that time decided to use the Espionage Act against him, because this was during the time of the rising project of, Dick Cheney and the sort of far right, the authoritarian, secret, restoring the power to the imperial presidency ideology. And during that time, even some of the prosecutors reportedly on the Morrison case were nervous to charge him with espionage because it was still sort of seen as a nuclear option. But it turned out that he was a fairly unsympathetic character, and not a lot of people came forward to speak out against him. And so when the government realized that they had a sort of that, a case that they could win and didn't have to worry about losing, potentially getting bad precedent, they charged him with espionage. And it was, even though it was widely seen as being a stretch, that this was really selling secrets to the enemies, the case went forward, and eventually he was pardoned. But by that time, the precedent was set. And then when you fast forward to the War on Terror, this is now in place for the Bush administration, for Cheney, for that project. And Tom's case really became sort of the premier case for it, what they wanted it to be. This was their opportunity. They were, I think, going to turn this into an official Secrets Act. They were upset because someone had gone to the press, and their pet surveillance program had gotten out. And it didn't matter that Tom had not disclosed any classified information to the press. They simply wanted to bring the hammer down and to show that they had this option to go after anyone who went to the press, whether it was protected by the First Amendment, whether it was classified or not. This was going to be the final stroke in converting it to an official Secrets Act. Fortunately, they didn't quite get away with it. In their case, they overstretched. And thanks to the efforts of my colleague Jesselyn Radack, who was able to sort of raise the alarm and really bring attention to this case, it became a loser. But it was a close call, and that precedent was set in future cases now against Reality Winner, Terry Albury. They've been increasingly winning those cases and getting harsher and harsher sentences. And so now, we're living in an era under Trump when a lot of people are asking why aren't more people coming forward? Why aren't people resisting from within these abuses? The abuses against immigrants and migration, ICE, in the detainee centers, in the police, the federal police on our streets. This is a moment when we should be, protecting that option, but instead we've let that precedent be set. And that was what Snowden warned us about. During 2013, 2014, a lot of people thought, he kind of sounded corny with his warnings of authoritarianism and turnkey tyranny. But now we're in that, we're on the precipice of that.
Go on, Tom.
Look, I was at the epigenesis of mass surveillance. I saw all the foundational programs, and Stellar Wind was this umbrella name for a whole host of programs, including a program that actually surveilled journalists and media outlets, interestingly enough, early on. And what Snowden, we're talking like a decade plus later, he sees the full metastasization, the cancer that was growing from within, that was literally taking over. This is how far it went. And he knew, given what had happened to me and others, that he was going to have to find a way to get this into the hands of independent journalists and bring it to light for the entire world, not just the United States. My case went pretty national. There was some international reporting, but it went supernova with Snowden. And the last thing Snowden could do is remain in the States. I mean, I became a political prisoner within, people don't realize exactly what the government did to me, even when I was awaiting my trial and facing 35 years in prison. They put all kinds of constraints on me. I was a virtual political prisoner in my own country. He has asylum, and kind of extended temporary residency in a country that he was actually transiting through. It was never his plan to go there. It was never his plan to live there. It was never his plan at all, right? To stop there. That was thank you to the U.S. government for revoking his passport. So he got stuck because, again, he had no proper papers to travel. My papers were taken from me. The irony in my case is sort of the flip side. They thought I was a flight risk, so I couldn't travel outside the U.S. And any place I travel in the U.S., I had to get special permission from, it was a pre-trial, they actually assign a probation officer a pre-trial, and the government had right of first refusal.
Yeah,
so,
with Snowden, they go so far, I believe, is when they think Evo Morales, the president of Bolivia, who has since been toppled in a coup, when they thought Snowden was on his plane, they actually get the Spanish government, I believe, to force his plane down, right?
Unprecedented.
Like
diplomatic, unprecedented.
It's like really an act of, neo-colonialism for the U.S. to be bullying a Latin American, sovereign state into forcing the president's plane down. And
they thought he was on board like Millennium Falcon, right? He was being stored, underneath one of the panels. They actually thought he was on that plane, and they were ready to rendition him right there on the tarmac out of Austria.
This is a shocking story. It's just
sure is.
Mind-boggling.
But you can see why he couldn't remain in the U.S. He would have had great difficulty mounting a defense, although there would have been a number of lawyers that would have come to his defense, including some that defended me, including Jesselyn Radack. There's no question in my mind, including other criminal defense attorneys who would have come to his defense. But he would have been completely silenced. I mean, I was silenced enough. I had no voice at all. Jesselyn Radack became my voice when I had none. The kicker is anything I said pre-trial could have been used against me. They could have been impeachable as evidence against me at trial. I mean, that's how Kafkaesque this whole thing is. Yeah, it's just stunning. I mean, shows you, I will just say it now, to the degree to which you've seen even reaction, bipartisan reaction. Oh my gosh, even the possibility that Trump could actually pardon Snowden has caused bipartisan support against pardoning Snowden. So the degree to which the U.S. has gone after, to the degree to which the U.S. charges people, just look at what was revealed, what crimes revealed, what abuse of power was revealed. That will tell you how sensitive it is, right? And how much the government wants to protect it from the public.
Well, let's go there. Why were Snowden's revelations in the public interest?
I mean, the simple answer for me is a version of why I went to the press. It truly was in the public interest. You can't have the government. I mean, we're talking about the governance structure of the United States of America deciding to just willfully violate the law as an act of commission because, hey, we've decided that it's better for national security, and it's not. And if we violate our rights, it doesn't matter. Violating rights in the name of national security is just the price we pay so we can all feel safe again. And that's the excuse. And remember, it's classified. You have the high priests of secrecy who have the classification system to hide behind. So if it's classified, or in my case, it didn't even matter if it was classified. Anything that came from the government was owned by the government and deserved the same level of protection. Another argument they make in all of this. And so, of course, Snowden brings out, people didn't believe me and some of my NSA colleagues or Diane Rourke, right, who knew about all this. I had gone to her destinedly to tell her. I had gone to others on the actual oversight committees created during the 1970s to provide oversight for the secret side of government, the side of government you really want to make sure stays in their lane. And yet Snowden saw all of this. People were like, that can't be possible. Where's the proof, Tom? My word and others wasn't sufficient. So he brings out the fuller documentation as just how large and how widespread and how, remember, it started in the United States and then it went global. A lot of people think, oh, it's global first. No, we actually did the mass surveillance regime in the United States first before it went global.
I mean, Tom, I remember in the run-up to Snowden's revelations, watching Democracy Now! And seeing you on as a frequent guest and seeing you talk about the types of mass surveillance that was going on. And when I would talk to people about this, they'd be like, no, there's no proof of that. That's not going on. So I do think you're right that, yep. Snowden proved that what people like you were warning about was absolutely true, and it's no longer something that people can deny anymore. Like, to a certain extent, I think a lot of people suspected the NSA was engaging in mass surveillance, but they would just flat out deny it. And now we have the proof.
But the irony for me, remember, the irony for me is history. History is screaming in my ears, even to this day. I grew up in the 1970s. Church Pike Committee, Pentagon Papers, Watergate, the resignation of a president, the formation of 2 standing committees, intelligence committees. Look, NSA, it came out, was actually spying on Americans and had been for decades during the Cold War.
Yes.
So we had this whole regime put into place called FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, passed in 1978. I mean, I was in the military, for a number of years. I was at NSA as we had all the specialized training every year. It was the prime directive. You cannot violate the rights of a U.S. person without a warrant. There was no warrantless surveillance. There was no blanket writ of assistance that gave, just like in King George III's time, the ability to give a piece of paper, right, to an officer, right, and just show up. Just show up, officer of the crown. I can take you, your papers, your effects away from you.
And I think it's really important to point out the Church Committee and the Pike Committee, because we know what warrantless surveillance looks like, right?
Yeah.
We know what warrantless surveillance, when it's justified for national security, actually does to the rights of Americans. There was plenty of warrantless surveillance going on pre-Church Committee. My specialty and background is more with the FBI than with the NSA. I host a podcast just dedicated to FBI spying. So I've spent a lot of time reading the Church Committee report sections on the FBI, and they absolutely claimed a right to engage in wiretaps, break-ins, and all sorts of other things. And they claimed, because this isn't a matter of criminal procedure, this is a matter of national security, the Fourth Amendment doesn't limit it. And what were they doing in the name of national security? They were going after people whose political views they didn't like. They were wiretapping Martin Luther King. They were setting up the Black Panthers. I mean, they always say, national security trumps this, national security trumps this, but it always comes back to abusing the rights of Americans, to silencing dissent at home. Not to hone in too much on the FBI, but I don't think people realize this. The FBI is also, in addition to a law enforcement agency, it's a domestic intelligence agency. The very first intelligence unit in the FBI was called the Radical Division, literally assigned the task of policing radicalism. And it was headed up by a person named J. Edgar Hoover, who, of course, went on to never be heard from again, right? No, he went on to head the whole agency and set it up like that. So, I mean, it's really important.
This is not new. That's the whole point. It's not new at all. Louis Brandeis, one of my favorite all-time Supreme Court justices. Olmstead versus NSA. That actually is a critical case from 1928. And although the government won it, later it was actually overturned in if you go back, this is a number of decades later. But that was like the standards. Like, oh no, when it comes to that, the government has special powers. He gave his dissent was extraordinary. He anticipated what this would mean going forward in terms of the right to be left alone.
And I believe he said the government is the best teacher in that case.
But the euphemism, national security now, but that becomes the blanket though. That's the excuse. We justify all of this in the name of, under the cover of, the color of national security. And after 9/11, it was just accelerated.
And for people who are watching at home and don't know what Olmstead is, it was a case in the Prohibition era about whether or not wiretaps required a warrant. The Supreme Court ruled they did not, using a very antiquated doctrine. The Supreme Court reverses course in the 60s, where under a case called Katz, where they rule that if you have a reasonable expectation of privacy and you subjectively think your acts are private, then a warrant is necessary, and that's why you need a warrant now to wiretap people on their phones. But in the middle here, Congress actually passed a law banning wiretaps and banning wiretaps from being used in court. This is really hard to imagine, but from a period between the 20s to the 1970s, like wiretaps in general are controversial, right?
Yeah.
Now we're debating how far can you go in wiretapping people.
Yep.
Well, maybe if you just get the metadata. But Lyndon Johnson actually vetoed a crime bill because it would give the federal government for the first time the power to wiretap. So that shows you how far the discourse has gone.
Yep.
But this entire time, the FBI and I'm sure other agencies as well are interpreting the law as not applying to them because they're not bringing information forward in court. They're not doing criminal investigations. They're doing quote unquote national security.
Yeah, and that lets them off the hook and they become outlaws.
Yes.
And Chip, I just want to, circling back to your question earlier about why were Snowden's disclosures in the public interest. One thing I want to underline for people is that a whistleblower isn't required to be 100% correct. They only have to have a reasonable belief that there was a, abuse of power, waste, fraud, danger to public safety, illegality. And that belief, whether you fully agree with Snowden or not, I think that reasonableness of his concern has been vastly borne out by what's happened in the years since then. Not only have we had a robust debate on privacy and secrecy that we never would have been able to have without his disclosures and without the documentation to know what we were talking about and have some idea what was happening behind the veil. That couldn't have happened. You've had at least one federal judge has ruled that program unconstitutional, illegal. We saw that the FISA court, as Tom mentioned earlier, the FISA court, the judges in the FISA court who are set up to handle classified, sensitive information, were not fully informed. We're very little informed of what was going on. So, and finally, as I've mentioned before, the Snowden's warnings about the dangers of having these programs that really are beyond the law and require us to trust simply the integrity of the person who's running them, that also has been borne out. And so I think we're beyond the point of proving that this was in the public interest and deserves some sort of protection. And that protection just doesn't exist for Snowden. I mean, when you have this level of disclosures, and keep in mind, these are some of the most important matters. It matters of our national security, of our individual physical security, of our rights, of our civil liberties. Those questions have been sort of secreted behind a veil. And those whistleblowers in those realms have nowhere to go. They have no protection. And so I think that that proves that a pardon would be eminently warranted in this case, whether it comes from Trump or not.
So that is
there are. Yeah.
Go on, Tom.
No, there are rights, but there's no remedies, right?
There's no remedies.
Jesselyn Radack says there's no remedies. There's no access to the courts. There's any number of whistleblowers that I can start naming who have gone up against even someone actually all the way to the Supreme Court and still got retaliated against, fired twice, right? I mean, it's just stunning. The level of retribution for simply holding up a mirror and exposing wrongdoing in the public interest. I mean, threats to public safety and health, abuse of power, violations of the law, billions and billions wasted. All this is actually in the public interest. So in essence, the government becomes a law unto itself, especially the secret side of government, or some refer to as the intelligence establishment. And one of the things I would hear at NSA, and I know this is chilling, and this is just to give perspective. I'm ultimately an optimist, but it's hard for me not to become too cynical about all this, given what happened to me. And I escaped with my freedom, just by this much. And that in itself is extraordinarily precious. But when I was at NSA, you would often hear this phrase: presidents come and go, but we're still here. Directors come and go, but we're still here. The NSA itself, and of course the other parts of FBI, but NSA itself was created in secret in 1952. People forget this incredible agency that was designed to, quote unquote, monitor the Soviet Union. That was its primary. It did a lot of other things. It was literally created by the stroke of President Truman's pen. It's like it was not part of the 1947 Security Act. which actually established the national security establishment. It was literally created out of thin air into existence. And it was ostensibly only supposed to do foreign intelligence, electronic. So when you start having it messing with domestic, and you combine it with the FBI, as you start to articulate a lot of that history, which I'm very familiar with. I used to be part of a team who would help put together the affidavit information, would go up to the secret court. That all got blown after 9/11. In fact, that entire court, that entire structure was bypassed because they knew when I confronted the lead attorney, and this is again, Snowden revealed the fuller metastasization of this. When I went to lead attorney, he said, it's all legal. The president has approved the program. It's all legal. It didn't matter what the law was anymore. Just didn't matter. They didn't need, in fact, I said, wait a minute. If the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which has been modified 5 times since 1978 to keep up with the technology, is insufficient, go back to Congress because they're the body that actually creates legislation that the president then signs into law or doesn't. And you got all, the whole bill thing and override and vetoes and everything else. He said, no, with what we want to do, they'll say no. You can imagine how chilling that was for me to hear. That with what we want to do, they'll say no. I knew in that moment, I could not remain silent. If I remained silent, I would be complicit. So now you have Snowden, a decade plus later, seeing how far this program has gone. How far is it infected, not just the body politic, but has buried itself inside the infrastructure of not just the United States, but the world. And guess who it's also in partnership with, by hook or by crook? Some cases knowingly and not knowingly. A whole lot of IT companies and telephone companies. So you have this extraordinary power, which was quite limited in the past, now being completely unleashed because all the obsession was we just need the data. If we just get enough of the data. So NSA and others became utterly addicted to the data. It became a hoarding complex. They just wanted more and more and more. And they figured if they pretty much have it all, they'll get to know it all. Even Alexander, the follow-on director of NSA, actually said, why can't we know it all? Wow, why can't we know it all? Jeez. This reminds me of the Stasi. I mean, in East Germany that I used to monitor flying in RC-135s during the latter years of the Cold War. I never imagined that surveillance mindset, psychology, would end up infecting even the secret side of our government, but it did. And Snowden, to his credit, brought all the critical documents out to show how far that surveillance system, a system of social control, had grown.
Yeah, and I want to add on to that, Snowden was sort of unique among our clients in that, a lot of our clients come to us after they have been trying to blow the whistle and go through internal channels, or after they have been retaliated against. Snowden was extremely thoughtful. Again, whether you disagree or agree with how he did it, he was extremely thoughtful in how he made these disclosures and brought this forward. You can't argue that he was being, reckless or careless. This is something that was extremely well thought out and prepared. He was very prepared. And I think and I wish, unfortunately Glenn couldn't join us tonight, but I think that one of the smart things that they did after the revelations was to really seize control of the narrative afterwards, because, the narrative will be set against you no matter how you handle yourself, no matter how you try to go through what channels and how you, which authorities you tried to go through. They will shame you and smear you 6 ways from Sunday. And so the way that they came out with that was very smart, and I think allowed the American people finally to see through that veil of lies, to see that, just because the government says that this person is a traitor, maybe there was some reason why, maybe there was some conflict of conscience that was happening there that required someone to speak out.
No, I think those are really great points. And Tom, when you were telling the story about how the NSA was founded, it was, I don't want to keep going off about the FBI, but that's how I spend most of my time thinking about them. Theodore Roosevelt's Attorney General went to Congress to ask them to create the FBI, and they said no. So when Congress goes on recess, they just create it anyways. And to this day, it has no statutory charter.
Correct.
So all of
Interesting you bring that up. Yes.
Yeah, and it started out as a law enforcement agency, not an intelligence agency, but then it claimed intelligence powers for itself. And in 1924, the Attorney General goes to Hoover and says, "Where are you getting these intelligence powers from?" And now the FBI puts its top priority as national security and intelligence, not law enforcement. So, I mean, these national security entities, this national security state, it gets in there and it grows and grows. So we're at time, and I want to ask you all the final question of the evening, which is, why do you think Edward Snowden should be pardoned? William, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think that a pardon for Edward Snowden would, aside from just being the just thing to do overall, I think that, especially after the era of Trump, I think we can all agree on how much damage he's done to the federal government and the public service. I think that a pardon for Edward Snowden would send the right message going forward that, we as a country, we value people who stand up and voice their conscience when they see something wrong, when they see something illegal.
It would be very un-Trump-like for him to do so. But I think given some of his own experiences and his own perceptions about intelligence, he has a sense. I'm going to give him some credit. He has a sense that things aren't quite right in that space, but because he's such the narcissist, it's all about him. So everything gets amplified, right? It gets completely amplified. And this is separate from all the conspiracy theories and everything else. But he actually has said the same thing about Reality Winner, interestingly enough. And she's incarcerated, right? She's awaiting an appeals right now in terms of her own case. And she's got COVID.
And Terry Albury is also in prison, FBI whistleblower.
Yep, that's yet another one.
And Daniel Hale is awaiting trial. So
yes. And a lot of those began or were initiated under Trump. Now, there were some that were brought forward, similar to what happened to me from Bush to Obama. Remember, Obama's the one that really set the frame here. Bush never actually, in the end, indicted. You have the Scooter Libby case, right, which was highly political. But in terms of going after whistleblowers, even Bush said, why prosecute? He actually said this. I'm channeling Bush, but and paraphrasing him, why prosecute over a policy difference? He was all policy difference for him. Of course, he was hiding, and he sort of gave the national security portfolio to Dick Cheney and just let him run with it. But here we are. And so Trump, there's an opportunity. There is. And would it set history straight? Because Snowden's looking at a very long life overseas and probably in Russia for some time if he's not pardoned. And given the bipartisan objection, which has been pretty strong opinion pieces and op-eds and other articles, I mean, bipartisan, we're not just talking Republicans, traditional, but also Democrats. They don't want to see Snowden pardoned. Part of it's political, right? The other hand, it's also the national security establishment that doesn't want to see him pardoned. It'd be great if he was. I mean, just given the dynamics. Does he deserve it? Yes. Look, I will tell you on a personal note, 2 formal attempts were made to pardon me. I technically was convicted, right? There was a pro forma sentence. I'm not a felon. It was a minor misdemeanor that I pled out to. 1 year probation and 240 hours of community service interviewing veterans from World War II to the present day. But there was attempts formally behind channels to pardon me, all to naught, right? Not just under Obama, but also under Trump.
Yeah, and at defending rights,
they wouldn't, because that's how bipartisan internally, and even the national security objects. If you cross them, they hold that grudge against you. You're supposed to remain silent. You're supposed to. It's almost the equivalent of the omerta oath. You don't dare speak out of turn, even when we're doing wrong, but we're doing wrong for the right reasons. Oh.
Yeah, and we saw William Barr this week was reported to be vehemently against this idea of pardoning Snowden. And we can assume that there are a number of such officials in Trump's ear, doing everything they can to block any talk of that idea. because it goes against their project of the Cheney, the William Barr project of building this secret government, this expanded presidential power.
Some want that back. They're actually looking for. I mean, this is ironically, in some ways, Trump is in the way of that in terms of reestablishing the primacy of national security. It is an irony of the Trump administration, but I will be the first to acknowledge it would be very un-Trump-like for Trump to pardon Snowden in the end.
So on that note, I'm going to say that, I think Edward Snowden deserves a pardon because it is ridiculous that we have a country in which people who lie us into war, people who build secret surveillance programs, people who break the Constitution, people who carry out crimes like torture escape scot-free. They get to go work for defense contractors and make money off of their government surveillance. They get to go on television and then, tell us all what we should be thinking. They get to go on back into government. But people who expose those crimes, people who tell the American people what their government is doing in their name, they end up indicted under the Espionage Act. Even when they get off, as you know, Tom, there's great personal cost to this. It's obscene that we do this in this country. I mean, indicting someone for giving the media truthful information about government misconduct, calling that espionage, that's something we associate with authoritarian regimes, not democracies. And it isn't just Snowden. Pardon Snowden, but also, Tom, I think you should be pardoned. I think other people who have been convicted.
John Kiriakou. Reality winner.
Terry Albury. I know Chelsea Manning got her sentence commuted.
He was commuted.
How about a full pardon?
Jeffrey Sterling, yeah.
Jeffrey Sterling, yes, pardon them all. These people are heroes. They are truth tellers. They have done a tremendous service to our public. And at Defending Rights and Dissent, we stand with them. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. If you want more information about our organization, you can find us at rightsanddissent.org. And I know Tom mentioned Daniel Ellsberg. Earlier this year, we did a webinar like this with Daniel Ellsberg, which you can find on our website, Facebook, or YouTube, wherever you're watching this. All of our past events are up there, including the one with Ellsberg. Tom, William, thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Thank you, Chip. Can I just say publicly, just a huge thank you to Defending Rights and Dissent and all your supporters for everything that you've done to stand behind whistleblowers and voices of conscience coming out of the national security state. You've been a great ally.
Yeah, we just need to continue defending our rights and defending the right to dissent at the same time.
Yes, that's what we do here.
Well, thank you.
And for people who were disappointed that Glenn could not make it tonight, I assure you we are working with his scheduler to bring him back later in the week for a short talk, maybe 10 to 15 minutes to hear what he would have said. Good night, everyone, and thank you for joining us.
Good night, all.